They say blood is thicker than water. But for 27-year-old Wren Mitchell, her own mother's blood held nothing but venom. Trapped in a dying industrial town where cops took bribes like paychecks, she woke up every morning expecting pain, and she went to bed praying for death. She thought this was her fate, that she was meant to be a punching bag for a bitter woman until her heart stopped beating. But destiny has a strange way of intervening. Sometimes salvation doesn't come in the form of a knight in shining armor. Sometimes it comes as a devil in a black suit, the boss of a criminal empire the entire city only dared to whisper about, and only in fear. A man who didn't ask for permission. A man who took what he wanted. This is the story of how a Mafia king stole a broken girl away from hell, and the shocking life she found in his darkness. If this story moved you, smash that like button, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next saga. See you in the next one. 6 o'clock in the morning, and the town of Ashford was still sunk in the dim darkness of a desert dawn. The rusted trailer on the edge of town shuddered under the early wind, patches of peeling paint clinging like dried fish scales. Windows filmed with so much dust that the light had to fight just to slip inside. Wren Mitchell opened her eyes on a worn-out old sofa. The springs had pressed into her back all night, but she'd been used to that feeling for a long time. She didn't have a room of her own, because the only bedroom belonged to her mother, and this torn-up couch had been her bed for 27 years. She pushed herself upright, bones crackling, eyes burning from too little sleep. Around her was a scene so familiar she could have drawn every detail from memory, even in a dream. Empty liquor bottles scattered across the floor, a cheap plastic ashtray overflowing with cigarette butts, the stale reek of damp tobacco mixed with sour alcohol punching straight into her nose. The old television in the corner still hissed and buzzed with static, because nobody had bothered to turn it off since last night. Wren didn't need an alarm clock. Her body had been trained to wake up before her mother opened her eyes. She rose quietly, tiptoeing around the shards of broken glass from a beer bottle someone had thrown the night before, and started the work she did every morning. She picked up bottles one by one, gathered the cigarette ash, scrubbed the floor with an old rag and a bucket of soapy water. This was her daily routine, a loop with no end. Clean up, get screamed at, clean again, get screamed at some more. She'd done it for so many years she couldn't even remember how many. The bedroom door snapped open, and Wren went rigid. Dolores Mitchell stepped out, eyes bloodshot, hair snarled like a crow's nest, her breath so thick with alcohol that Wren could smell it from 10 feet away. She was 58, but she looked 70, her face carved deep with the wrinkles of bitterness and hatred. Her eyes swept the room, hunting for something to complain about, and as always, she found it. "Why haven't you finished before I got up?" "Useless." Dolores's voice was hoarse, sharp as vinegar. "I'm sorry, Mom." Wren lowered her head, eyes fixed on the floor. She'd learned long ago that looking Dolores straight in the eye only made everything worse. Dolores walked over to where Wren was kneeling to scrub, stared at the bucket of soapy water for a second, then kicked it hard. Dirty water splashed everywhere, soaking the floor Wren had just cleaned. "Do it again. Make it clean," Dolores said, her tone flat and cold. Wren didn't argue. She only nodded, and quietly went to get more water. Dolores dropped onto the sofa Wren had just gotten up from, lit a cigarette, dragged in a long pull, then exhaled a cloud of smoke. "Tonight you bring home $200. Rent money. Cigarette money." She said it like she was giving orders to a dog. Wren swallowed. "I only make around $80 to $100 a night." Dolores lifted her hand. Wren flinched at once, curling in, both hands flying up to shield her face on instinct. Her body had memorized being hit so many times it reacted before she could even think. But the blow didn't come. Dolores only gave a thin little laugh, cold and empty. "Then you find a way. If it's not enough, you know what happens." She said it, looking at Wren the way you'd look at trash. Wren lowered her hands, trying to hide the trembling. On her arm, old bruises were fading, shifting from purple to a sickly yellow-green. On her wrist, a faint scar ran along the skin, the leftover mark of a dark night she'd tried to forget. She nodded, still staring at the floor. "Yes, I know. $200. A number she couldn't reach. A time bomb ticking down, second by second. Wren finished cleaning the trailer in silence, changed into the cleanest clothes she owned, then stepped outside. She stood at the trailer door and drew a deep breath. The desert air, dry and already warming, filled her lungs, but at least it didn't stink of liquor and smoke. She looked up at the sky as it slowly brightened, and wondered if there was any other world beyond this hell. Then she shook her head, pushed the useless thought away, and started walking toward the bar. Tonight's shift would be long, and she had to make those $200, no matter what it took. 8 o'clock at night. Wren pushed open the old wooden door of the Rusty Nail and stepped inside. This was the place she'd worked for 4 years now. 4 years of endless nights, of hungry stares, of crude flirting she had to swallow down and carry in silence. The bar sat in the center of Ashford, a flimsy wooden box with weak yellow lights that glowed as if they might die at any moment. The smell of stale beer, sweat, and cigarettes clung to every wall, every chair, every sticky floorboard underfoot. Tired faces were scattered around the room, mostly miners just off shift, men who came here to drown their misery in cheap beer. Benny Caruso stood behind the counter, wiping a glass with a rag that was probably dirtier than the glass itself. He was 45, pot-bellied and bald, with eyes that always slid away from trouble. When he saw Wren come in, he gave her a small nod and went back to his work. No questions, no concern, not even a word about the bruise on her cheek that had turned a dull, sickly yellow. In Ashford, people learned not to ask questions they didn't want the answers to. Wren tied her apron around her waist and started her shift. She wiped tables, cleared empty glasses, poured beer, moved between the customers like an invisible shadow. She'd learned how to make herself as small as possible, how to keep her head low enough to avoid attention, how to smile just enough to earn tips but not enough to be mistaken for an invitation. But no matter how hard she tried, the eyes still followed her. The men in the bar watched her with open hunger, their gazes sliding from her face down to her chest, down to her hips, shameless and unhidden. She kept her distance, gave nothing back, never met their eyes. When she passed a table in the corner, a drunk man suddenly reached out, grabbed her hip, and yanked her toward him. "You've got a pretty ass, little sister." He cackled, his breath thick with cheap whiskey blowing straight into her face. Wren startled, her heart hammering out of rhythm, but she only stepped back, gently pried his hand off without saying a word. She didn't dare fight. She'd seen girls who fought back get fired, get hit, get dragged out into the parking lot in the dark. Benny, behind the bar, saw the whole thing. He shook his head, let out a tired sigh, and looked away. No intervention, no protection. That was the unspoken rule at the Rusty Nail. The customer was always right, and the staff had to handle it themselves. The night crawled by as slowly as water dripping from a broken faucet. Wren served one table after another, smiling until her face ached. At 10:30, she slipped into the bathroom and counted the tips in her apron pocket. $60, $70, $85. Her heart sank. She was still $115 short of $200. Fear rose in her throat like bitter syrup. She remembered the last time she hadn't brought in enough money. 3 weeks ago. Dolores had lashed her back with a belt until her skin split and bled, until she didn't even have the strength left to cry. The red welts across her back had taken nearly 2 weeks to heal, and she'd had to sleep on her stomach the whole time because she couldn't lie on her back. Wren clenched the crumpled bills in her hand, fingers trembling. "I have to make it. I have to make it," she whispered to herself, staring into the mirror, into the empty eyes of the girl staring back. She drew a deep breath, forced the fear down to the bottom of her chest, and walked back out to keep working. There were still a few hours before closing, a few more hours to pray for a miracle. 11 o'clock at night. The Rusty Nail was more crowded than it had been all evening. Miners getting off late poured in, loud laughter bouncing off the walls, glasses clinking sharp and bright, a scratchy country song rasping from the old jukebox in the corner. Wren hurried back and forth between tables, sweat beading along her forehead, feet aching from standing too long. She'd managed to scrape in another $15 in tips, bringing her total to $100. She was still short $100, still too far away. She tried not to think about it, tried to keep her mind on the work in front of her. Then, all at once, the air in the bar changed. Wren felt it before she saw anything, as if the temperature dropped by a few degrees, as if the room thickened, heavy and tight. The chatter shrank, then cut off. The music kept playing, but nobody was listening anymore. Wren lifted her head and looked toward the door, and she saw them. 4 men walked into the bar. They wore black suits, the kind of expensive suits Wren had only seen in Mafia movies. Fabric that caught the weak light with a quiet sheen, tailored so precisely every seam looked sharp. They didn't belong here. They were like wolves stepping into the middle of sheep, and the sheep knew it. Leading them was a man around 6'2", broad-shouldered, with hair black as ink, and eyes the color of cold steel. His face was all hard angles, a square jaw, with the ruthless beauty of an ancient Greek statue. He entered the bar like he owned the room, like he owned the town, like he owned the world. He didn't need to look at anyone, because everyone was looking at him. Ren watched the people around her. The big miners, the same men who'd been laughing loud and grabbing at her earlier, now dropped their eyes and avoided meeting the gaze of the man who'd just walked in. Some stood up, quietly left money on the table, and slipped out as if they'd suddenly remembered something urgent at home. Nobody dared look straight at him. Nobody dared breathe too loudly. Ren caught a whisper from the table beside her. Ashford, a trembling voice. That's Killian Ashford. The name meant nothing to Ren. She didn't read the paper, didn't watch the news, didn't have the time or the energy to care about the world beyond a rusted trailer and this miserable bar. But she didn't need to know who he was to feel the danger rolling off him. Her instincts, sharpened by 27 years of living with a violent mother, were screaming a single word in her head: danger. The men walked straight to the VIP table in the corner, the only table with leather chairs instead of hard wooden ones. They sat down, and one of the men with him lifted a hand to call for service. Ren started to turn away, to pretend she hadn't seen, but Benny appeared at her side before she even knew he was there. His face was pale as if he might faint, sweat shining on his bald head. Ren, you serve that table, he said, his voice shaking. Ren stared at him like he'd just told her to jump into a fire. Why me? Why not someone else? She asked, pleading. Benny grabbed her arm, pulled her closer, and lowered his voice to a harsh whisper. Because nobody else dares. And because you're the only one who's never spilled a drink on a customer. He looked at her, fear and begging tangled together in his eyes. Go, serve them, and don't do anything stupid. Don't look him in the eye. Don't talk too much. Don't do anything that makes him notice you. Understand? Ren swallowed, her throat dry and bitter. She nodded, picked up a serving tray, and started walking toward the VIP table. Her heart pounded in her chest, each step heavy as lead. She didn't know her life was about to change forever. Ren reached the VIP table with her head bowed, eyes fixed on the tray in her hands. She tried to make herself as small as possible, tried to become invisible, tried to keep anyone from noticing she existed at all. What can I get you? She asked, so softly it was almost a whisper. Killian Ashford didn't look at her. He was speaking to the man beside him, a tall, thin guy with closely cut hair and eyes as cold and lifeless as dead fish. The situation on the east side needs to be handled this week, Killian said, his voice low and steady, like distant thunder. I don't want to hear any excuses. The thin man nodded, then turned to Ren. Whiskey, the whole bottle, he said, his tone flat, without feeling. Ren nodded quickly and turned back toward the bar to fetch it. Relief washed through her at the chance to step away from that table. Even for a moment, she grabbed the most expensive whiskey Benny had, the kind he saved for special occasions, along with 4 clean glass tumblers. Her hands shook as she set them on the tray. She hadn't eaten anything all day. Her body was drained from hours of standing and running, and now the stress was wringing out what little she had left. She took a deep breath, tried to steady her hands, and went back to the VIP table. She set the glasses down one by one, careful as if they were made from the thinnest glass in the world. Then she opened the whiskey and started to pour. That was when it happened. Maybe she was too tired. Maybe her hands were shaking too hard. Maybe fate simply wanted to toy with her. As she tipped the bottle to pour into the first glass, her foot caught on the table leg. She lost her balance. The bottle tilted, and whiskey splashed out, nearly spilling onto Killian Ashford's hand. Time seemed to stop. Ren froze, the bottle still in her grip, eyes wide with horror. Her heart skipped a beat. No. No. She'd almost spilled liquor on the Mafia boss the whole town feared. She was going to die. She was sure of it. Reflexes carved into her bones by 27 years under Dolores made her move before she could think. She shut her eyes, hunched her shoulders, bowed her head, and let her arms hang limp at her sides. The posture of an animal waiting to be struck. A posture she'd taken 1,000 times before. Every time she did anything wrong. Every time Dolores lifted a hand. She waited. For the slap, for the fist, for the familiar pain. But nothing came. No blow. Only silence. Silence that stretched so long Ren could hear her own heartbeat thudding in her chest. She opened her eyes slowly, confused, not understanding what was happening. And she saw Killian Ashford watching her, His gray eyes weren't blazing with anger the way she'd imagined. They were cold, yes, but not the cold of rage. They were the cold of observation, as if he was reading her, dissecting every tiny detail on her face. His gaze moved slowly, from her terrified eyes, to the way her shoulders stayed tight as if bracing for a hit, to the faint bruise on her cheekbone that a thin layer of makeup couldn't fully hide. Something shifted in his expression, just a flicker. So quick, Ren wasn't sure she hadn't imagined it. And then it was gone. "Who hit you?" Killian asked. His voice was low and calm, but there was an edge to it that made Ren shiver. The question was so blunt it stunned her. No one had ever asked her that. No one had ever cared enough to ask. "No, sir. I fell," she said, the answer spilling out automatically, as if it had been programmed into her, the lie she'd repeated for years and years. Killian watched her for a few more seconds, and Ren had the sick feeling he could see straight through her, past the shell she'd built, past every lie she'd ever told. "Don't lie to me," he said. Not a threat, simply an order. Ren didn't know what to say. She stood there trembling, mouth opening, but no words came out. The thin man beside Killian observed the whole exchange in silence, his face blank. Finally, Killian gave a small nod, as if he'd found the answer he needed without her saying a thing. "Go," he said. Ren didn't need to hear it twice. She hurried away from the VIP table, moving so fast it was almost a run, and slipped into the corner behind the bar where Benny stood. Her heart was still racing, and she couldn't explain why those cold gray eyes wouldn't leave her mind. Ren kept working, forcing herself to focus on the glasses that needed wiping, the beer bottles that had to be carried to tables, anything at all to keep her mind from drifting back to the VIP corner. She could feel those gray eyes still on her, even though she didn't dare turn around to confirm it. His question kept echoing in her head. "Who hit you?" No one had ever asked her that. No one had ever cared. She shook her head, tried to shove the thought away, and slipped her hand into her apron pocket to count her tips again. $95. She'd made another 10 from a table that had just left, but she was still $105 short. $105 she had no idea how she was going to find in the last hour before closing. Fear began to crawl up her throat like cold fingers. Dolores wouldn't forgive her. Dolores never forgave. Then the bar door flew open with a sharp, jarring bang. Ren whipped around, and the blood in her veins turned to ice. Dolores Mitchell stood in the doorway, a black shape against the weak yellow streetlight outside. She was so drunk she could barely stay upright, hair wild like a crow's nest, a filthy, wrinkled nightgown hanging off her, bloodshot eyes sweeping the room with a crazed, searching glare. The whole bar went silent. Every face turned toward the deranged woman at the door. "Ren! I knew you were here!" Dolores shrieked, her voice like shattered glass ripping through the air. Ren froze, her feet glued to the floor as if someone had poured cement around her ankles. No, not here. Not in front of everyone. She prayed it under her breath, but God had abandoned her a long time ago. Dolores spotted her, those red eyes locked onto their prey, and she lunged toward Ren like a wild animal. She barreled through the bar, knocking chairs aside, sending glasses, tipping, caring about nothing and no one except her daughter. Ren wanted to run, wanted to hide, but her body refused to obey. She only stood there trembling, watching the storm rush toward her. Dolores seized her by the collar, bony fingers like claws biting into the fabric, and yanked her out into the middle of the bar. Ren stumbled forward, almost losing her balance, but Dolores held her tight, wouldn't let her fall. "Where's the money?" Dolores screamed in her face, breath reeking of alcohol so strong it made Ren's stomach twist. "I need the money now. Mom, I haven't been paid yet. I only have $95. Ren tried to explain, voice shaking, tears rising. "Not enough," Dolores shrieked, and before Ren could react, she slapped her with the force of a falling hammer. The blow was so hard Ren went down on the floor, her knee crashing into the hard wood, her cheek burning like it had been pressed to hot iron. Her ears rang, the world blurring for a second. She heard Dolores screaming something, but the words stopped meaning anything. Then pain tore through her as Dolores kicked her in the ribs. "You sells, just like your father. Useless." Each word came with a kick, each kick shoving her farther across the sticky floor. Ren curled in on herself, both arms over her head, the defensive posture she'd perfected through thousands of beatings. She didn't cry. She'd forgotten how to cry a long time ago. She only waited for the storm to pass, waited for Dolores to get tired, waited for what couldn't be avoided. Around her, the bar was silent as a grave. No one stepped in. The big men who'd been grabbing at her earlier turned their faces away, pretending they didn't see. Benny crouched behind the counter, eyes down, hands polishing the same glass he'd been polishing for 5 minutes. No one helped her. No one ever helped her. Dolores lifted her hand, ready to hit her again, and Ren squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the pain. But the blow didn't come. Instead, she heard a pained grunt. Not from herself, but from Dolores. Ren opened her eyes slowly, and what she saw made her doubt her own vision. A hand had caught Dolores's wrist in midair, stopping the strike cold. The hand was large, fingers long and powerful, silver rings flashing under the weak yellow light. Ren looked up, and there stood Killian Ashford, big as a mountain, those gray eyes like ice fixed on Dolores. He had appeared from nowhere, moving fast and silent as a shadow, and now he was between Ren and her mother, a wall that couldn't be climbed. "Let go," Killian said. His voice wasn't loud. It could have been called almost gentle, but it sucked the air out of the room. It was the voice of a man who didn't need to shout to be heard, a man used to giving orders and being obeyed. Dolores tried to wrench her arm free, eyes bulging with rage and liquor. "Who the hell are you?" she screamed. "This is my family business. That girl is my daughter. I can do whatever I want to her." Killian didn't answer. He only tightened his grip, and Ren heard bone grind and crack. Dolores moaned, her face twisting with pain, and she was forced to let Ren go. "I said, let go," Killian repeated, each word driven into the air like a nail. He looked at Dolores the way people look at an insect, cold and contemptuous. Then, still holding her wrist, he started dragging Dolores toward the door. She fought, tried to pull away, but next to Killian she was only a child struggling against a grown man. Useless, completely useless. Ren lay on the sticky floor, cheeks swelling, ribs throbbing, watching the two figures move toward the exit. She didn't understand what was happening. For 27 years, no one had ever intervened. No one had ever stepped between her and Dolores. No one had ever protected her. And now a stranger, a mafia boss the whole town feared, was hauling her mother outside like a garbage bag. Ren didn't know what she was supposed to feel. Fear, gratitude, confusion, everything tangled together into a mess inside her chest. She only lay there, watching the door slam shut behind them, and wondering what kind of crossroads her life had just been pushed onto. Ren pushed herself up from the barroom floor, pain pulsing through her body, and ran after them outside. She didn't know why she did it. Maybe because she was afraid Dolores would be killed. Maybe because she didn't know what would happen next. Maybe because she'd spent 27 years running after her mother like a loyal dog, and her body didn't know any other way to be. When she reached the door, the thin man she'd seen sitting beside Killian was blocking the way. He didn't say a word, only shook his head once and held out a hand to stop her. But she begged with her eyes, and maybe he saw something there, because in the end he stepped aside and let her pass. She shoved the door open and stepped out into the cool Nevada desert night. Outside the bar, under the weak yellow streetlight, Killian was facing Dolores. He'd released her, but Dolores didn't dare run. She stood there, rubbing her bruised wrist, eyes wild with anger and alcohol. But there was something else in her stare that Ren had never seen before. Fear. Dolores was afraid. The woman who had terrified Ren her entire life was trembling now in front of a stranger. "Does she beat her often?" Killian asked, his calm so cold it raised gooseflesh. Dolores gave a sharp, scornful laugh, trying to pull her usual cruelty back on like armor. "She's my daughter. I can do whatever I want. Who are you to stick your nose into someone else's family?" Killian didn't answer. He only stood there, silent, watching Dolores with those icy gray eyes. The quiet stretched so long Ren could hear the desert wind slipping through the empty parking lot. Then, slowly, Killian reached inside his suit jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. $100,000. Cash, he said, his voice without emotion. Dolores went still. Her bloodshot eyes locked onto the envelope, and Ren watched something shift in her mother's face. Greed. Hunger. The look of a wolf spotting meat. "What do you want?" Dolores asked, her voice suddenly softer, the edge of it dulled. Killian pointed toward Ren, and it felt like someone had squeezed the air out of her lungs. "Her," he said. "She will work for me. You will never contact her again. You will not come near her. You will not look for her. From this moment on, she is no longer your daughter." Ren's head spun. Her. He was talking about her like she was merchandise, something that could be bought and sold. Her. as if she weren't human at all. "What?" she blurted, voice shaking. "What are you saying?" But no one paid attention to her. Dolores was staring at the envelope, eyes bright as headlights. $100,000. Enough to buy booze for the rest of her life. Enough to wipe out every debt and still have plenty left over. More than everything Ren had ever earned for her in 27 years. Ren looked at her mother, and a part of her, the part that was still naive after everything she'd endured, still hoped Dolores would refuse. Hoped she would say no, that's my daughter. I won't sell my daughter. Hoped that somehow, even if Dolores hit her, screamed at her, tormented her, she was still her mother, and she loved her in some crooked way. But hope was the most expensive thing in the world, and Ren should have learned that long ago. Dolores snatched the envelope from Killian's hand. "Take her," she said, not hesitating for even a second. "She's useless, but the money's yours. Do whatever you want with her." It felt like someone had driven a knife into Ren's chest and twisted it. She watched her mother count the bills, one by one, lips moving with each number. Dolores didn't ask a single question. Not what would happen to Ren. Not where she would go. Not whether she would be safe. Not one question at all. She only counted, then stuffed the envelope into the pocket of her filthy nightgown and turned away. She didn't look back. Didn't say goodbye. Didn't give one last glance to the daughter she had just sold. She simply vanished into the night, her hunched back shrinking until it disappeared into the dark. Ren stood there, tears sliding down her cheeks, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. She watched her mother go, watched the woman who had given birth to her, raised her, and beaten her for 27 years. The woman who had just sold her for $100,000 without a second of hesitation. Ren had always known Dolores didn't love her. She'd known it for a long time. But knowing and witnessing were two different things. And tonight she had witnessed her mother sell her the way you sell an old thing you no longer need. You have two choices. Killian's voice cut through her thoughts. He stood there, tall under the streetlight, gray eyes on her, expressionless. Run after her, or come with me. Ren swallowed, her throat bitter. What will you do to me? She asked, voice rough. Killian studied her for a long moment before he answered. You'll work for me. I'm not promising heaven, but I am promising no one will hit you again. Ren looked down the road where Dolores had disappeared, then looked at Killian. One side was the hell she knew. The other was a darkness she didn't. One side was the mother who had just sold her. The other was the stranger who had just bought her. She didn't know what waited for her if she went with Killian. She didn't know who he was, what he wanted, what he would do to her, but she did know what waited if she went back to Dolores. The belt, the screaming, the pain, until the day she died. I'll go with you, she said, quiet but steady. Killian nodded, as if he'd known she would choose that. He turned and walked toward a glossy black SUV parked at the far edge of the lot. Ren drew one deep breath, then followed him, stepping into the dark, leaving 27 years of hell behind her. The black SUV glided smoothly down the road, the engine rumbling low, like the breath of some enormous beast. Ren sat curled into the far corner of the back seat, arms wrapped tight around herself, trying to make her body as small as it could possibly be. She didn't dare move. She didn't dare breathe too loud. She didn't dare do anything that might draw attention. The thin man she'd seen in the bar sat in the driver's seat, silent as the name she'd heard someone call him, Ghost. He drove with a blank expression, eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if transporting a girl who'd just been sold was something he did every day. Killian sat up front, staring out the window, his sharp features shadowed against the dark glass. He didn't speak. He didn't turn to look at her. It was as if she didn't exist. The SUV rolled through Ashford, and Ren stared out at the world she'd lived in for 27 years. Shuttered factories with broken windows like hollow eyes, empty streets under weak yellow streetlights, crooked little houses with rusted tin roofs. This was her home, and she was leaving it for good. She didn't know what she was supposed to feel. Sadness, relief, terror. It all blended together into a heavy knot in her chest. I've just been sold to the Mafia, she thought, and the thought made her stomach turn. I'm going to die. Or worse, she'd heard the stories about women sold to powerful men, stories that didn't end happily. She looked down at her hands in her lap and saw they were still trembling. The silence inside the car stretched, heavy as lead, only the engine and the hiss of tires on pavement. Then, without warning, Killian spoke, his voice low and even, like distant thunder. You're scared. He didn't turn around. It wasn't a question, It was a statement. Wren swallowed, her throat dry and bitter. Yes, she whispered, seeing no reason to lie. Good, Killian replied. That means you're not stupid. Silence returned, dragging on for a few more seconds. Then he spoke again, still as calm as if he were discussing the weather. But I didn't buy you to hurt you. Wren blinked, not sure she'd heard him right. Then why? She asked, so softly it was almost a whisper. Why spend $100,000 to buy a useless bar waitress? Killian didn't answer. He kept staring out the window, and Wren understood the conversation was over. They left the town behind and merged onto the highway toward Las Vegas. Wren watched the lights of the city of sin glitter on the horizon, but they didn't drive into the city. Instead, the SUV turned onto a smaller road, heading deeper into the desert mountains. The road grew emptier, darker, the night swallowing everything around them. They passed through multiple checkpoints, and each time, men dressed in black with guns at their hips nodded at the SUV and opened the gates. No one asked for identification. No one searched the vehicle. They saw Killian and lowered their heads immediately. Wren watched it all in silence, and her fear grew with every checkpoint they passed. She was moving deeper into a Mafia king's territory, and she knew that once she was inside, she might never get out again. Then she saw it. On top of a hill, in the middle of the empty desert, a mansion rose like a dream. Warm golden light spilled from dozens of windows, lighting up a white stone facade that gleamed beneath the moon. A towering iron gate opened onto a driveway paved with pale gravel, trimmed hedges lining both sides. A marble fountain stood grandly before the front doors, water arcing high and falling like glittering diamonds. Wren had never seen a place like this outside of movies. This wasn't a house. This was a palace. This was the world of the rich and powerful, a world she'd never imagined she would set foot in. But she knew the prettier the place, the higher the price. There was no such thing as a free lunch. And $100,000 wasn't small money. The SUV stopped at the front entrance. Killian stepped out, walked around the vehicle, and opened her door for her. It was a gesture so courteous, Wren didn't know how to respond. No one had ever opened a door for her. Welcome to your new home, Killian said, his voice without emotion, but his gray eyes rested on her with something she couldn't read. Wren stepped out, legs slightly unsteady, and lifted her gaze to the massive mansion looming in front of her. Her heart tightened, half from fear, half from curiosity. She didn't know what waited behind those doors. But whatever it was, it couldn't be worse than a rusted trailer and Dolores's screaming. Or at least, she hoped it couldn't. Wren stepped through the massive oak doors and felt as if she'd crossed into another world. The mansion's grand hall was so enormous, she could have set Dolores's trailer inside it and still had room left over. The ceiling soared overhead, painted with classical murals, and a crystal chandelier glittered like 1,000 stars. A sweeping staircase of pure white marble curved up toward the second floor. The floors were polished so bright she could see her own reflection in them. Wren stood there with her mouth slightly open, feeling completely out of place, like a blot of ink on a sheet of spotless white paper. She didn't belong here. She was a bar waitress with bruises on her body and worn-out clothes on her back, standing in the middle of a palace worth millions. A middle-aged woman appeared, neat, in a black and white uniform, her face stern but not unkind. I'm Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, she said, professional, but with a hint of warmth. I'll take you to your room. Wren nodded, not knowing what to say, and followed the housekeeper up the stairs. The room Mrs. Henderson brought her to was larger than the trailer she'd lived in for 27 years. A king-sized bed sat in the center, dressed in crisp white sheets and pillows that looked impossibly soft. A private bathroom with a white porcelain tub and gold-plated fixtures. A wide window facing the endless desert under silver moonlight. And most of all, the thing that made Wren stare twice, 3 times, to make sure she wasn't imagining it. A lock on the door, from the inside. Mr. Ashford said, "You can lock your door," Mrs. Henderson said, as if she'd read Wren's thoughts. "No one comes in unless you allow it. That's the rule." Wren looked at the lock, then at the housekeeper, unable to believe what she was hearing. She waited for the trap, waited for someone to laugh in her face and tell her it was all a joke. But Mrs. Henderson only nodded to her and left, closing the door behind her and leaving her alone in a room that felt like a stranger's dream. That first night, Wren didn't dare sleep in the bed. She sat in the corner with her back against the wall, knees pulled up to her chest, eyes never leaving the door. She'd locked it, checked it 3 times to be sure, but she still didn't believe it. She waited for someone to break in, waited for Killian to appear and demand what men always demanded from women, waited for the true price of $100,000 to reveal itself. But nothing happened. The night passed in silence. Only the desert wind outside the window, and the steady pound of her heart in her ribs. No one knocked. No one tried the lock. When dawn began to seep through the curtains, Ren was still there, exhausted, unable to sleep. The next day, Killian met her in the dining room. He sat at the head of the table with a cup of black coffee in front of him, and he gestured for her to sit across from him. Ren sat down, back straight, shoulders tight, braced for anything. "You will do housework," Killian said, his voice flat, without emotion. "Cleaning, cooking if you want. Salary is $5,000 a month. You keep it all." Ren blinked, not sure she'd heard correctly. $5,000? But I don't understand, she said, voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" Killian looked at her, gray eyes giving nothing away. "There are rules," he said. "Don't go into the basement. Don't ask about my work. Other than that, you're free." "Free?" Ren repeated, as if it were a foreign word she'd never heard before. "You can move around the mansion, read, watch television. You're not a prisoner." Killian stood, preparing to leave. "But don't try to run," he added, not threatening, simply certain. "Not because I'll punish you, because there's nothing out there waiting for you." 1 week passed, then 2. Ren began to grow used to her new life, though she still couldn't fully trust it. She cleaned the mansion, even though there were staff to do it. She cooked, even though there was a chef. She needed something to keep her hands busy, something to keep her mind from sinking into the dark places. The staff treated her kindly, a kindness she wasn't used to. They greeted her each morning, asked if she needed anything, smiled at her as if she were a person and not trash. Then one day, while she was dusting the second-floor hallway, she found the library. The wooden doors opened, and Ren stood there, eyes wide in shock. Thousands of books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, shelves towering like castles, a sliding wooden ladder to reach the highest rows. The scent of old paper and ink filled the room, a smell Ren had always loved. She loved to read. It was the one thing that had kept her sane through the hell years with Dolores. But she'd never had enough books, only torn old ones pulled from trash bins or borrowed from the public library. She stole one quietly and read it at night when the house was asleep. She read in the corner of her room under a dim lamp, as if she were doing something forbidden. One night she couldn't hold back her curiosity and slipped into the library to find more. She stood between the tall shelves, fingers trailing along spines. When the door opened, Ren spun around, heart racing, and saw Killian standing there. She panicked, jumped to her feet, the book slipping from her hands. "I'm sorry. I'll put it back. I didn't know I wasn't allowed," she stammered, bracing for anger. But Killian only walked over, bent down to pick up the book, and studied the cover. "Jane Eyre?" he asked, not angry. Ren nodded, heart still pounding. "You like Bronte?" "I like reading," she whispered. "Anything." Killian watched her for a long moment, then sat in the armchair by the window and set the book on the table. "You can read any book in here," he said. "I'm not forbidding it. This library exists to be used, not to sit here like decoration." And for the first time, they truly talked. About books, about the worlds inside the pages, about fictional characters who sometimes felt more real than the people outside. When Ren left the library that night, her lips curved into a small, hesitant smile, as if she'd forgotten how to smile and was learning again from the beginning. But it was real, the first real one in years. A month passed inside the Ashford mansion, and Ren began to grow used to her new life in a way she never thought she could. She grew used to the soft bed, to full meals, to not being hit every day. She grew used to the library and nights that stretched late with books, to brief conversations with Killian about literature and art. But there was one thing she couldn't get used to: the nightmares. They came every night like uninvited guests, slipping into her sleep and turning it into hell. Tonight was no different. In the dream, Ren was kneeling on the floor of the rusted trailer, and Dolores loomed over her, huge as a monster, mouth open, screaming curses down at her. "Useless. Trash. You should have never been born." Dolores's thin laugh echoed inside Ren's head, and then Dolores's arm lifted, and Ren saw the leather belt whip down. She screamed and jolted upright, drenched in sweat, heart thrashing like it wanted out of her chest. She sat in the dark, gasping, and it took her a few seconds to remember where she was. Not the trailer, the mansion. Safe. She was safe. Then came a soft knock at the door, and she flinched. "Ren? Are you okay?" Killian's voice carried through the thick wood, low and worried. Ren blinked, stunned. She hadn't expected him to come. She hadn't expected him to hear her from his room. She hadn't expected him to care. She slid off the bed, legs unsteady, crossed to the door, and opened it. Killian stood there in simple sleep clothes, a black t-shirt and long pants, his hair slightly mussed from waking up. He looked nothing like the cold Mafia boss in an expensive suit. He looked closer, less frightening, almost human. "I'm okay," Ren said, her voice rough. "Just a nightmare." Killian studied her, the red rim of her eyes, the way her hands still trembled. "Can I come in?" he asked, his tone unexpectedly gentle. Ren hesitated for a second, then nodded and stepped aside. Killian walked into the room, but he didn't come close to her. Instead, he went to the armchair by the window and sat down, leaving a safe distance between them. Ren appreciated that. She sat on the edge of the bed and pulled the blanket up over her chest like an invisible shield. Silence settled between them. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who didn't need to fill the space with pointless words. Finally, Ren spoke. The question she'd wanted to ask since the first night she'd stepped into this mansion. "Why did you save me? Really? I have nothing to give back. I'm just a useless bar waitress. Why spend $100,000 to buy me?" Killian didn't answer right away. He looked out the window, at the endless desert under silver moonlight, at the vast darkness that seemed to match his own past. The quiet stretched so long Ren thought he wouldn't answer at all. Then he spoke, his voice low and distant, as if it came from somewhere far away. "I had a little sister, Cora." Ren listened, barely daring to breathe. "My mother remarried when I was 15. Cora was 12. Our stepfather was a successful businessman, rich, respected by everyone. But behind closed doors, he was a monster." Killian paused, jaw tightening, and Ren saw his hand curl into a fist on his thigh. "He beat Cora. My mother knew, but she did nothing. She was afraid of being left behind, afraid of losing money, afraid of losing status. She chose silence and looked away. I tried to protect Cora. Every time he lifted a hand, I stepped in front. But I was young. I was weak. He hit me every time I interfered, hit me until I couldn't stand up anymore. Then he turned back to Cora. Ren felt tears spill over, warm tracks down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them. She only sat there and listened. When I was 19, Cora was 16, Killian went on, his voice turning rough. One night I came home late from work. When I walked in, Cora was lying on the floor, and he was standing over her with a belt in his hand. He hit her too hard. Traumatic brain injury. She never woke up again. Silence. Heavy. Painful. Ren didn't know what to say. She only sat there, tears pouring, heartbreaking for a girl she'd never met. Killian turned to look at her, and for the first time, Ren saw something in his cold gray eyes. Pain. Deep and old, but still alive. I killed my stepfather after that, he said, without regret. He was the first person I ever killed. I don't regret it. I only regret I didn't kill him sooner. He held Ren's gaze, and she didn't look away. You remind me of Cora, he said. That look, fearful, resigned, waiting to be hit. I saw that look every day for 4 years. I saw it in Cora's eyes. And I saw it in yours that night in the bar. Killian stood, stepped a little closer, but still kept distance. I couldn't save Cora. But I can save you, Ren cried. Not from fear, not from pain, but because for the first time in her life, someone understood her. Someone saw her, not as property or a punching bag, but as a human being worth saving. She reached out and took Killian's hand. His hand was large and rough, the hand of a killer, but under her touch it was warm. I'm sorry about Cora, she whispered, voice breaking. She must have loved you so much. Killian looked down at her small hand on his, and something softened in his gray eyes. She deserved better, he said, barely louder than a breath. Just like you. They sat there in silence, hands still joined, and for the first time, Ren didn't feel alone. 3 months passed inside the Ashford mansion, and Ren Mitchell was no longer the girl who cowered in the rusty nail. She didn't notice the change all at once. It came slowly, the way dawn slips through a curtain, gradual but certain. First, it was the way she moved. She no longer walked with her head down, no longer folded in on herself as if she wanted to disappear from the world. Her back grew straighter, her steps more sure, and her eyes began to meet a person's gaze when she spoke. Then it was her voice. She didn't whisper anymore like she was afraid of being heard, didn't end every sentence with an apology. She spoke clearly, steadily, and sometimes she even dared to argue. She learned to cook with the mansion's chef, a cheerful Italian man named Giuseppe, who taught her how to make pasta from scratch, and never once yelled when she ruined a dish. She learned basic self-defense with Ghost, the quiet man who turned out to be a patient teacher, showing her how to punch, how to kick, how to break free from an attacker's grip. She read through nearly half the library, devouring books the way a starving person devours a feast. And for the first time in 27 years, she felt like a human being, not trash, not a punching bag, not the useless thing Dolores had always called her. Her relationship with Killian changed too, in ways she hadn't expected. They began eating dinner together every day, at first because Killian demanded it. But little by little, it became a habit they both looked forward to. They sat across from each other in the vast dining room, candlelight trembling between them, and they talked about books, about art, about history, about philosophy. Killian taught her chess, and she was surprised to discover she had a gift for it. He told her about traveling the world, about museums in Paris, temples in Greece, rainforests in South America. Ren listened with bright eyes, imagining places she'd never believed she would see, and she began to voice her own opinions. She disagreed with Killian about the ending of Wuthering Heights, and she said so plainly. She argued with him about Heathcliff, about toxic love, about redemption. She waited for him to get angry, to tell her to shut up the way Dolores would have. But Killian only tilted his head, the faintest curve touching his mouth, and said she had an interesting point of view. He started asking for her opinion on other things, not his work, but smaller matters. Which painting should hang in the living room? Which book should he read next? And Ren, for the first time in her life, felt respected. One night, with a full moon hanging over the desert sky, Ren stood on the balcony outside her room, looking up at the field of stars. She heard footsteps behind her and didn't need to turn to know who it was. Killian stepped beside her, their shoulders nearly touching, and stared out at the wide desert under silver light. They stood in silence for a long time, the comfortable silence only people who understand each other can share. "I used to think I'd die in that trailer," Ren said at last, her voice light as the night wind. "Die and nobody would know, nobody would care." She turned to look at him. "That's the scariest part. Not death, but disappearing like you never existed." Killian nodded, moonlight carving shadows across his angular face. "I know that feeling," he said, low and distant. "When Cora died, I wanted to die too. I thought if I died, at least I'd see her again." Ren watched him, watched the old pain still living in his gray eyes. "Then why did you keep living?" she asked, barely a whisper. "Because I wanted the person who did it to pay," Killian answered, jaw tightening. "Anger kept me alive when nothing else did." "And now?" Ren asked, and she saw something shift in his gaze. "Now." Killian turned to her, moonlight reflected in his eyes like stars. "I have a different reason." A tense silence hung between them, heavy and electric. Ren couldn't breathe. Then Killian lifted his hand, slowly, gently, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But she didn't. His fingers touched her wrist, the faint scar Dolores had left years ago. He didn't ask about it. He didn't need to. "You deserved better than what you had," Killian said, his voice rough. Ren felt tears rise, but this time they weren't from pain or fear. "I already have it," she whispered, voice breaking. They looked at each other, and something shifted between them, clear and fierce as lightning splitting the night sky. Ren saw it in Killian's eyes, the restrained hunger, the tenderness he tried to hide behind coldness, and she knew he saw the same thing in hers. But neither of them spoke it aloud, neither of them moved. They only stood there under the silver moon, his fingers still resting on her wrist where the old scar was slowly fading. They stayed that way until the moon shifted, until the night wind turned colder, and then Killian let his hand fall away, nodded to her, and walked off. Ren remained on the balcony, watching his shadow disappear down the dark hallway, her heart racing in her chest. She knew it, as surely as she knew the sun would rise tomorrow morning, that she had fallen in love with her devil. While Ren was living the most peaceful days of her life, in the dark veins of Las Vegas, an enemy was watching. Judge Hammond Crane's office sat on the top floor of a luxury building in the heart of the city, looking down on the glittering strip of neon below like a king surveying his kingdom. The room was dressed in expensive oak, the walls crowded with awards and certificates, the shelves packed with thick law books that had likely never been opened. Everything in that office radiated respectability, trust, fairness, but the man behind the desk was anything but those things. Hammond Crane was 62, hair silver as wire, his face lined with the kind of wrinkles people like to call signs of experience and wisdom. He wore a costly gray suit, gold-rimmed glasses, and at a glance no one would have guessed he was one of the most corrupt men in Nevada's justice system. His eyes were cold as a snake's, and behind the respectable shell was a soul rotten to the bone. Sitting across from Crane was Roy Pemberton, a man of 38 with a face so ordinary it was easy to forget. Nothing striking, not handsome, not ugly, not memorable, not invisible either. Exactly the kind of face people trusted, the kind they opened up to, the kind that didn't raise suspicion. And that was exactly why Crane hired him. "Report on Ashford," Crane said, his voice low and cold. Pemberton opened the leather briefcase on his lap, pulled out a thick file, and set it on the desk. "He's got a new girl. Wren Mitchell, 27, bought from her birth mother in the town of Ashford 3 months ago for $100,000. Crane leaned forward, his eyes lighting with the gleam of a predator catching scent. Human trafficking. He smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Perfect. If we can get the girl to testify against Ashford. Trafficking, unlawful confinement, violence. We can put him in prison and throw away the key." Pemberton flipped through a few pages, his brow tightening slightly. "There's a problem. She doesn't seem to be confined. I had people watch her. She moves freely in the mansion. She's even been taken shopping in the city." Crane waved a hand, cutting him off with impatient contempt. "It doesn't matter what the truth is. It matters what she will say." He rose, walked to the window, and looked down at the city below. "Get close to her. Pretend you're the good guy. Show her a way out. Show her she's being used and doesn't even know it. Then when she trusts you, we'll have everything we need to bury Killian Ashford." Pemberton nodded, but a question hung on his mouth. "What if she refuses?" he asked, voice neutral. "What if she won't cooperate?" Crane turned, and for the first time the respectable mask slipped, showing the monster beneath. His gaze darkened, cold and merciless. "Then we make her agree, by any means." He went back to the desk and sat down, fingers lacing together in front of him. "Killian Ashford thinks he can threaten me, thinks he can cut me off and leave me behind like a stray dog." Crane had once been a partner to the Ashford Empire, taking bribes to shield crime, to erase convictions, to make evidence disappear. A relationship that benefited both sides, until Killian discovered Crane was playing both ends, taking Ashford's money while selling information to rivals. Killian had cut him off immediately and threatened to expose everything if Crane ever touched his empire again. Since then, Crane had lived in fear and hatred, waiting for a chance to strike back. And now that chance had arrived, wearing the face of a brown-haired girl from the town of Ashford. "Make sure you don't fail," Crane said, his voice like cooled steel. "I want Killian Ashford to pay for everything he's done to me." Hundreds of miles away, in the mansion on the hill in the Nevada desert, Wren slept soundly in her warm room. She dreamed of silver moonlight, of gray eyes watching her with a tenderness no one had ever given her, of warm fingers touching her wrist where the old scar was slowly fading. She smiled in her sleep, for the first time in 27 years, smiling without fear. She didn't know darkness was crawling closer. She didn't know an enemy was watching, planning, waiting for the right moment. She only knew that tonight, for the first time in her life, she felt safe. And sometimes, that was the most dangerous thing of all. A week later, Wren went shopping for the first time with money that was truly her own. Killian had transferred her first month's pay into an account he'd opened for her, $5,000, a number she'd never dared to dream of through 4 years working at the Rusty Nail. She stood in front of the mirror in her room wearing a simple dress Mrs. Henderson had laid out, and she barely recognized the woman looking back at her. No bruises, no frightened eyes, no shoulders drawn tight as if waiting for a hit. She looked like an ordinary person, and the feeling was both strange and wonderful. Ghost drove her to a shopping mall in Las Vegas, a massive complex with hundreds of stores Wren had only ever seen on television. He followed a few steps behind her, keeping a distance of several feet, close enough to protect her but far enough that she didn't feel watched. Ren wandered through clothing stores, past glittering counters of jewelry and cosmetics, but her feet carried her to the place she'd always wanted most, the bookstore. She stepped inside and drew a deep breath of new paper and coffee drifting from the little cafe in the corner. She moved along the shelves, fingers brushing spines, reading titles, feeling like a child turned loose in a candy shop. She chose a few books. Wuthering Heights because she wanted to reread it after her argument with Killian, a new mystery novel by an author she loved, and a book of poetry by Emily Dickinson. She paid, heart racing, because this was the first time she'd bought books with her own money, not battered copies pulled from dumpsters, not borrowed volumes from the public library. She walked out with the bag in her hand and a smile on her mouth. Then she bumped into someone. The collision knocked the bag from her fingers and sent the book skidding across the marble tile. "Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't watching where I was going." A man's voice rose, warm and genuinely remorseful. Ren looked up and saw a middle-aged man bending down to gather her books. He looked about 38, with a face so ordinary it was almost forgettable, yet somehow pleasant, with warm brown eyes and a friendly smile. He wore a light blue shirt and khaki pants, the kind of outfit an office worker might wear. Nothing remarkable, nothing frightening. "It's okay," Ren said as she took the books back from him. "It's my fault too. I wasn't looking either." The man glanced at the top title, and his face brightened. "Wuthering Heights?" he asked, sounding truly surprised. "You like classic literature?" Ren smiled, feeling at ease with this simple, accidental conversation. "Yes, I like the Brontes, both Charlotte and Emily." "Wonderful." The man nodded in approval. "You don't find many people reading the classics these days. I'm a book lover too, especially Victorian-era work." They talked for a few minutes more, about books, about authors, and Ren was surprised to realize she was genuinely enjoying it. The man was charming, funny, and most of all, not threatening. He didn't look at her with the hungry eyes the barmen had. He didn't stand too close. He didn't do anything that made her feel uneasy. "Are you new to the city?" the man asked gently. "I don't think I've seen you before, and I come to this bookstore pretty often." Ren nodded. "Yes, I moved here a few months ago." "Alone?" Ren hesitated for a second, unsure how to answer. "No, I live with a friend," she said, and the man nodded without pressing. He seemed to know when to stop, to sense when a question would become too personal. It made Ren relax even more. Before they parted, the man reached into his pocket, pulled out a business card, and handed it to her. "I'm a consultant," he said, his smile still warm. "If you ever need help with anything at all, you can call me. This city can be hard on people who are new." Ren took the card and looked down at the neat print. "Roy Pemberton, consultant." "Thank you," she said, slipping it into her pocket without thinking much of it. It was only a random run-in with a friendly stranger, nothing to worry about. The man gave her one last smile, nodded goodbye, and walked away, melting into the crowd of the mall. Ren watched him for a second, then turned and almost collided with Ghost. "Do you know him?" Ghost asked, voice flat, expressionless, but his eyes tracked the direction the man had disappeared. "No, just a stranger I bumped into," Ren answered, a little surprised by the question. "He helped me pick up my books." Ghost kept watching for a few more seconds, eyes narrowing as if he was filing something away, but in the end he only nodded and said nothing more. They went back to the SUV, and Ren didn't think about the meeting again. She didn't tell Killian about the man in the bookstore, not because she meant to hide it, but simply because she didn't think it mattered. It was just a random conversation with a friendly stranger. What was there to mention? But in her pocket, Roy Pemberton's card lay quiet as a time bomb, waiting for the moment it would explode. 5 months after Ren set foot in the Ashford mansion, the fateful night arrived. 2:00 in the morning. The mansion was drowned in darkness and silence, only the desert wind outside the windows, breathing like some enormous sleeping beast. Ren lay in her room, curled beneath soft blankets, dreaming of books and gentle gray eyes. She'd grown used to this feeling of safety, so used to it she no longer slept in the corner of the room, no longer startled at every small sound, no longer feared the night when it fell. A few rooms away, Killian sat in his study, the desk lamp throwing a dim pool of light across his angular face. Thick files lay open in front of him, numbers and charts he'd been studying for hours. His empire was having problems. Someone was trying to sabotage him from the inside, and he needed to find the traitor before it was too late. But he didn't know it already was too late. The explosion tore the night apart. A deafening boom erupted from the front gate, so strong the entire mansion shuddered. Glass shattered, walls cracked, and alarms began to howl, shrieking like a monster. Killian shot up from his chair, instincts honed by decades in the underworld, snapping him into motion. He grabbed the gun from his desk drawer, chambered around, and ran into the hallway. "Ghost," he roared, as gunfire erupted from downstairs, rapid and relentless, coming from multiple directions. Ghost appeared out of the darkness, his face as blank as ever, but his eyes bright with alertness. "At least 20. Rifles. Professional. This isn't a street gang, it's mercenaries," Killian swore, blood boiling. "Ren?" he demanded. And in the voice of the cold Mafia boss there was something Ghost had never heard before. "Fear. I'll get to her," Ghost said, turning to run for the stairs. But it was too late. The attackers had breached the outer defenses and flooded inside. Killian and Ghost fought like demons, every shot carrying death, every punch hard enough to drop a grown man. They took down 5, 10, 15 attackers, but more kept pouring in like tidewater. And then it happened. A bullet tore through Killian's shoulder, blood bursting like a spring, staining his white shirt red. He staggered, legs unsteady, but forced himself upright. Ren. He had to get to Ren. She was upstairs, alone, unprotected. If they found her... Ren jolted awake at the blast, her heart slamming against her ribs. She didn't know what was happening, only that something terrible was unfolding. Gunshots, shouting, the crash of breaking glass echoed from below. Her first instinct was to run, to hide under the bed the way she had for 27 years whenever Dolores's rage erupted. But she wasn't that girl anymore. Killian, she thought, and a new instinct, born in the last 5 months, drove her out of her room and toward the gunfire instead of away from it. She needed to find Killian. She needed to know he was safe. She ran down the dark hallway, heart pounding like a war drum, and then someone grabbed her from behind. An arm locked around her waist, a hand clamped over her mouth. She fought, tried to scream, but couldn't. Then she heard a familiar voice, and the blood in her veins turned to ice. "I'm sorry, Ren." The voice of the man from the bookstore, Roy Pemberton, but it wasn't warm and friendly anymore. Now it was cold and calculated. "But you have to come with me." Ren twisted her head, eyes wide with horror. It was him, the man she'd met at the mall, the man who'd picked up her books, the man who'd handed her his card and told her to call if she ever needed help, the man she'd thought was a kind stranger. "You," she tried to say, but Pemberton didn't give her the chance. "Let me go," she screamed, thrashing with every ounce of strength Ghost had taught her. But Pemberton was stronger, and he'd come prepared. One punch to her temple, and Ren's world went black. Killian saw her. Through the chaos, through gunsmoke and bodies, he saw Ren unconscious in the arms of a stranger. He saw the man dragging her toward the back door, pulling her into the dark. "Ren," Killian roared, the howl of a wounded animal. He tried to rise, tried to run after her, but his legs wouldn't hold. Blood was still pouring from his shoulder, and the world around him began to spin. Ghost grabbed him, stopping him from chasing. "Boss, you'll die if you go after her. You're losing too much blood." Killian didn't listen. He only watched Ren's shadow vanish into the night, vanish into the darkness, vanish out of his reach. He screamed her name until his voice went raw, until his knees buckled, until he sank to the floor in his own blood in the mansion's great hall, surrounded by corpses. And in the dark, Ren disappeared as if she had never existed. Ren woke in darkness, her head splitting like it had been struck with a hammer. She tried to open her eyes, but the light from a single ceiling bulb hanging above her made her squint. She tried to move, and realized her hands were tied tight to the arms of the chair with rough rope, scraping her wrists raw, burning her skin. Her ankles were bound to the chair legs too, and no matter how hard she struggled, the knots didn't budge. She looked around, trying to understand where she was. A dim room with gray concrete walls, no windows, no furniture except the chair she sat in and another chair facing her. The stench of dampness and engine oil punched into her nose. An abandoned warehouse, she guessed, somewhere far from the city, far from anyone who could hear her scream. "Good morning, Ren," the voice came from the shadows, and Pemberton stepped into the circle of light. He looked nothing like the friendly man from the bookstore. His face was cold, and the brown eyes she'd thought were warm were empty now, dead fish eyes. The pleasant smile was gone, replaced by quiet contempt. "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" Ren asked, her voice hoarse with thirst. Pemberton didn't answer. He only stared at her like a man waiting for a show to begin. The metal door creaked as it opened, and another man walked in. Older than Pemberton, maybe 60, hair silver as wire, wearing an expensive gray suit and gold-rimmed glasses. He looked like a judge, or a university professor, dignified and commanding. But his eyes, Wren looked into them and saw something that made her shiver. The coldness of a man willing to do anything to get what he wanted. "She's awake." "Good," the man said, pulling the other chair closer and sitting down, one leg crossing over the other as casually as if he were in his own living room. "Miss Mitchell," he said, smooth and polite. "I'm Hammond Crane. I have a few questions for you." Wren watched him, trying to keep her voice steady though her heart was pounding out of control. "I don't know who you are. I don't know anything." Crane gave a soft chuckle, the chuckle of a man who'd heard that line 100 times and never once believed it. "You lived with Killian Ashford for 5 months, he said, tilting his head as if studying an insect under glass. "You know a great deal, whether you realize it or not." He pulled a thick file from inside his suit jacket and dropped it onto her lap, opening it so she could see. "Ashford is a murderer," Crane said, flipping through pages. "Drug trafficking, money laundering, extortion. This is the evidence." Wren looked down at the file, at the surveillance photos, at the documents stamped in red, at the reports packed with words. She saw faces of men she didn't know, huge numbers, lists of names she assumed were victims. Her chest tightened. "You will sign this," Crane continued, pulling out a sheet of paper and placing it in front of her. "You will confirm that Ashford bought you, confined you, abused you, forced you to work. You will testify in court, and we will put him in prison where he belongs." Wren stared at the paper, then at Crane, then shook her head. "No," she said, small but firm. "He didn't hurt me." Crane tilted his head, a look of fake surprise sliding over his face. "Really?" he asked, mocking. "He bought you from your own mother for $100,000. Like buying merchandise, like buying an animal, and you're telling me he didn't hurt you?" Wren fell silent, and in that silence, doubt began to creep in. She looked at the file on her lap, at the proof of Killian's crimes. She knew he wasn't a good man. She'd seen how cold he could be when he gave orders, how ruthless he could be when he faced enemies. She knew there was blood on his hands, knew he was the boss of a criminal empire. A part of her wondered, do I really know him? Or am I only seeing what I want to see? Crane watched her, reading the hesitation on her face, and he struck at her weak spot like a snake striking prey. "You think he loves you?" he asked, his voice soft and dripping with poison. "He only sees his dead sister in you. Cora, you're a replacement, a stand-in for what he lost. He doesn't love you. He loves the memory of her. You're nothing at all." The words stabbed into Wren's heart like a knife. She swayed, doubt crashing over her like a tidal wave. Was it true? Was she only a substitute for Cora? Was everything Killian had given her only a shadow cast by grief? But then she remembered. She remembered the night he told her about Cora, the pain in his gray eyes, the way he looked at her like she was a human being and not a ghost. She remembered the balcony, his fingers brushing the scar on her wrist, his voice rough when he told her she deserved better. "He isn't perfect," Wren said, lifting her head and looking straight into Crane's eyes. Her voice trembled, but it held. "He's a murderer, a criminal, a monster in a lot of people's eyes. But he never hit me, never forced me. He gave me choices my mother never did. He gave me a room with a lock, books to read, freedom to become myself. He may be a monster to the world, but to me, he was the first person who ever treated me like a human being." Crane watched her, and the fake politeness slid off his face, replaced by cold anger. "So you refuse to cooperate?" he asked, his voice like cooled steel. "I won't betray the man who saved me," Wren answered, and she surprised herself with how certain her own words sounded. Crane stood, adjusted his suit jacket, and turned to Pemberton. "Pemberton," he said, flatly. "Give her time to think." Pemberton nodded, his hand curling into a fist. Wren saw it, and she knew what was coming. She closed her eyes, thinking of Killian, thinking of gentle gray eyes, thinking of the safety of the mansion on the hill. Then Pemberton's fist came down, and her world fell into darkness. 3 days passed in the abandoned warehouse, and Wren Mitchell still didn't sign. She sat on the hard wooden chair, wrists still bound, her face bruised purple and green from Pemberton's endless beatings, lips swollen and split, one eye nearly sealed shut from the swelling. Her body ached everywhere, every breath like a knife sawing into her ribs, but she still didn't sign. Every time Crane shoved the paper toward her, every time Pemberton raised his fist, she shook her head. She didn't know where the strength came from. Maybe from the years of enduring Dolores, maybe from Ghost's self-defense lessons, maybe from the memory of gray eyes that looked at her like she deserved to be protected. Crane stood over her now, the fake politeness gone completely, replaced by rage and impatience. "Last chance," he snarled, face flushed red. "Sign it, or you die here." "I'm not kidding." Ren lifted her head and looked at him with the one eye she could still open, and she laughed. A weak laugh, pained, but real. "Then kill me," she rasped, her voice raw with thirst and exhaustion. "At least this time I'll die because I chose it, not because someone decided for me." Crane stared at her for a long moment, and Ren saw something shift in his eyes. Cold calculation replacing anger. He signaled Pemberton, and Pemberton pulled a gun from his waistband and stepped up beside Ren. He pressed the barrel to her head, the metal ice cold against her temple. Ren closed her eyes and drew one slow breath. She wasn't afraid. She'd been afraid for 27 years, and she was tired of fear. She thought of Killian, of gentle gray eyes, of the balcony under moonlight, of warm fingers touching the scar on her wrist. At least she'd learned what it felt like to be cared for, even if only for a few short months. At least she'd lived like a human being before she died. At least this time, she would die by her own choice. Then hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted outside the warehouse, not a single shot but a barrage, rapid and brutal like hail. Shouts, footsteps, glass breaking, metal clanging. Crane spun around, his face draining pale. "What is that?" he yelled, but no one answered. Pemberton jerked the gun away from Ren's head and turned toward the door, just as the heavy steel door blew open like something monstrous had kicked it in, and Killian Ashford walked in. He looked like he'd stepped straight out of hell. His shoulder was still bandaged, blood seeping through the white gauze and spreading across his shirt, his face gray with blood loss and sleeplessness. But he was upright, and in his hand was a smoking gun. Behind him, Ghost and a team of men surged in, weapons raised, eyes sweeping the room. But Ren didn't see them. She only saw Killian, only saw those gray eyes searching the shadows for her. When their gazes met, she saw something in him she'd never seen before. Pure fear, fear of losing her. Pemberton reacted fast, swinging his gun toward Killian, finger tightening on the trigger. But Killian was faster. One sharp blast, and Pemberton dropped to the floor, a bullet hole between his brows, dead before he hit the ground. Crane's men tried to fight back, drew their weapons, fired a few wild shots, but they were no match for Ghost and Killian's crew. In seconds, they were all down, motionless on the concrete. Only Crane remained, alone, shaking like a leaf in a storm. Killian walked toward him, step by step, unhurried, each footfall steady as the heartbeat of death. He wasn't rushing. He wanted Crane to feel fear. He wanted him to understand what was coming. Crane backed up until his spine hit the wall, nowhere left to run. "Wait," he screamed, voice trembling. Respectability gone. Nothing left but a cowardly old man begging for his life. "I'm a judge. Kill me and you'll be hunted. The FBI will never let you go." Killian didn't stop. "I'm already hunted," he said, his voice cold as ice. He grabbed Crane by the throat with one hand and lifted him off the ground like a rag doll. Crane kicked and thrashed in the air, clawing at Killian's arm, but it was useless. "You touched her," Killian said, his voice deep as thunder. "You hit her." He stared into Crane's eyes, and in his gray gaze was a fire that belonged to hell. "You die." There was a dry crack as Killian snapped Crane's neck with his bare hand, as simple as breaking a dead branch. Crane's body hit the floor like an empty sack, head tilted at an impossible angle, eyes still wide in eternal terror. Ren saw it all. She saw Killian kill with his hands, saw the cold brutality in every movement, saw the true devil he'd hidden behind the mask of a gentleman. And she wasn't afraid. Killian turned to her, hands still bloody, breathing hard, and he waited. For fear, for horror, for her to look at him the way everyone else did, for her to turn and run. But Ren didn't. Ghost cut the ropes, and she stood on shaking legs. She walked toward Killian, one step at a time, past the bodies, past the blood, through all of it. And when she reached him, she wrapped her arms around him, pressed her face to his chest, not caring about the blood, not caring about anything except the feeling of being in his arms. "You came," she whispered, voice breaking. Killian held her back, crushing her close like he was afraid she'd vanish if he let go. Like he feared this was a dream, and he'd wake up with empty hands. "I will always come," he murmured into her hair. Always. They stood there, surrounded by corpses and the bitter smell of gunpowder, holding each other as if the outside world no longer existed. A week had passed since the horror of the abandoned warehouse. The Ashford mansion had been repaired, bullet scars in the walls patched over, shattered glass replaced, blood scrubbed clean from the floors. But nothing could erase the memory of that night. Wren sat in front of the mirror in her room, watching the bruises on her face slowly shift from purple to sickly yellow-green. They would heal, she knew that. She was used to waiting for wounds to close. Killian was healing too. The injury in his shoulder sealed over, though he still winced whenever he moved too sharply. But there was something that wouldn't heal, the tension hanging over the mansion like a black cloud. Wren felt it in the way the staff whispered to each other, in the way Ghost kept going in and out of Killian's study, in the way Killian looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, like he was trying to memorize every line of her face. That afternoon, Wren passed Killian's study and heard Ghost's voice carry through the door. "They're digging into everything again. The FBI, the state police, all of them. A federal judge going missing isn't small. In a few weeks they'll find a lead that points back here." Wren stopped, her heart tightening. She'd known it was coming, but hearing it said out loud still made her dizzy. That night, while Wren was reading in her room, there was a knock. Killian stood in the hallway, his face unreadable. "Come to my study," he said, voice level. "We need to talk." Wren closed her book, stood, and followed him with a heavy heart. Killian's study was lit by the dim glow of a desk lamp, shadows dancing on the walls. On the desk, directly in front of Wren, sat a thick envelope. "Open it," Killian said, his tone without emotion. Wren picked it up, lifted the flap, and stopped breathing. Inside were stacks of cash so thick she couldn't begin to count them. Beside the money was a new passport with her name on it, an ID with a new identity, and a plane ticket to Oregon. "What is this?" she asked, though she already knew. $2 million, Killian said, as calmly as if he were talking about the weather. "Your new life. A new identity. You can go anywhere, do anything, buy a small house, open a bookstore, live the normal life you deserve." Wren stared at the envelope, then at him, and she saw what he was trying to hide behind that cold mask. "Pain. And you?" she asked, barely a whisper. Killian turned away, looking out the window into the night. "I have to leave. Europe. Start over. But that life isn't for you." "Why not?" Killian faced her again, and for the first time she saw those cold gray eyes tremble. "Because I'm a monster, Wren," he said, his voice rough. "You saw me kill. With my bare hands. No hesitation. And I'll kill again. That's who I am. That's the world I live in. You deserve more than that. You deserve to live in sunlight, not in the dark, with a devil like me." Wren looked down at the envelope in her hands. $2 million. Freedom. Safety. A life she'd never dared to dream about. She could leave right now, step out of this world of crime and violence, start over as a normal woman. She could have a small home with a garden, a cozy bookstore, a quiet life with no blood and no guns. Then she threw the envelope back onto the desk. "I don't want it." Killian stared at her, eyes widening. "You don't understand." "No," Wren shouted, and it was the first time she'd ever shouted at him. The first time she didn't lower her head, didn't shrink, didn't fold into fear. "You're the one who doesn't understand." She stepped toward him, tears spilling, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. "I lived in hell for 27 years, she said, voice shaking but strong. "My mother hit me, screamed at me, sold me like an old broken thing. No one loved me. No one cared whether I existed. I thought I'd die in that rusted trailer. Die and nobody would know. Nobody would remember." She stopped in front of him, lifted her chin, looked straight into his eyes, and she saw those gray eyes quiver. "Then you showed up," she went on. "You pulled me out of hell. You gave me a room with a lock, books to read, freedom to become myself. You looked at me like I was a person, not trash, not a punching bag. For the first time in my life, I felt like I mattered. You are my family. The only family I've ever had." She took his hand and held it tight. "I don't need heaven if you aren't in it. I'd rather live in the dark with you than live in the light alone." Killian stood frozen, and Wren saw something she'd never seen before. His eyes went wet. "Ren," he whispered, voice breaking. "I love you," she said, trembling but steady as stone. "I love you, the devil and the man. I don't need you perfect. I just need you." Silence hung between them, heavy and taut. Then Killian pulled her into his arms and kissed her. The kiss was fierce, desperate, like it was his last breath, like he'd waited his entire life for this moment. Ren kissed him back, pouring all her love and certainty into it. When they finally broke apart, Killian rested his forehead against hers, breathing hard. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. "Don't care." Ren answered, smiling through tears. "I choose you." They stood wrapped in each other in the dim room, and Ren knew that no matter what darkness came, she wouldn't face it alone anymore. Before dawn the next morning, when the sky was still dark but the horizon had begun to blush pink like a promise of a new day, a black SUV glided through the quiet outskirts of Las Vegas, heading toward a private airfield set deep in the desert. On the runway, a private jet waited, with its engines humming softly, a whisper of freedom. Killian, Ren, and Ghost stepped out of the vehicle and drew in the sharp, cold desert air of early morning. They were leaving everything behind. The hilltop mansion with its library of thousands of books, a criminal empire built over decades, old names, old lives, all of it. Killian had handed power to a trusted second-in-command, a new chapter for the organization, a new era without him. Ren carried only one thing in her small bag, Jane Eyre from the library, the first book she'd read in the mansion, the book that had quietly witnessed the moment they began to trust each other. Before climbing the steps into the plane, Ren paused and turned to look back at Las Vegas in the distance. The neon still burned in the night like millions of fallen stars, the city that never slept moving on as if nothing had changed. She thought of the rusted trailer on the edge of Ashford, of Dolores with her bottle and her curses, of 27 years of hell she had survived. She thought of the rusty nail, of the trembling girl who used to serve beer to drunk men, of the girl who curled in on herself and waited to be hit whenever she did something wrong. That girl was gone. That girl had been buried the night Killian Ashford walked into that bar and asked who had hurt her. The person standing here now was someone else entirely. Killian came to her side, shoulder to shoulder, and looked out at the city with her. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice low and gentle. Ren shook her head without hesitation. "No. For the first time in my life, I don't regret anything. Will you miss this place? You'll miss where I found you." Ren smiled and turned to him. "But I won't miss where I was trapped. This isn't home anymore. My home is somewhere else now." They climbed the steps and entered the cabin. The interior was luxurious, cream leather seats and glossy walnut. But Ren wasn't surprised anymore. She'd grown used to this world, used to the kind of luxury she'd only seen in movies before. She took the window seat. Killian sat beside her, and his hand found hers and held tight. Ghost sat across from them and gave his usual nod, his face still as cold as ever, yet something in his eyes looked almost like approval. The jet began to move, rolling faster down the runway, and then it lifted, breaking through a thin layer of cloud, heading toward the sun rising at the horizon. Ren looked out the window as Las Vegas shrank below, as the Nevada desert stretched out like a golden carpet, as dawn spilled gold across the sky like a promise of a new beginning. "This is the first time I've ever watched a sunrise without being afraid," she whispered, and Killian squeezed her hand tighter. "Where are we going?" he asked. Ren turned to him and smiled, the brightest smile she had ever worn. "Anywhere you are." She was no longer a victim. He was no longer a monster. As the plane climbed through the clouds toward the rising sun, they became something else entirely. They became legend, a story people would whisper in the dark, about the Mafia king who left an empire behind for a broken girl, and the girl who refused $2 million to go with her devil. People would ask whether it was love or madness. Maybe it was both. Maybe real love always carries a little madness in it. Sometimes hell isn't the place that holds you captive. Sometimes hell is the place that leaves you alone. And Ren, for the first time in 27 years, wasn't alone anymore. She had found home, not in a mansion or a plane or anywhere on a map, but in the gray eyes of a devil who taught her how to live. The story of Ren and Killian leaves us with deep lessons about life. First, no one deserves to be treated cruelly, even by family. Love never comes with violence and control. Second, salvation can come from the places you least expect. Sometimes the person society calls a monster has a kinder heart than the people who carry the title of family. Third, you deserve love and respect not because of what you can do, but because of who you are. And finally, home isn't four walls. Home is the place where you're loved and accepted without conditions. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our emotional stories each day. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever experienced loneliness like Ren? Do you believe love can heal every wound? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We would truly love to hear what's in your heart. Thank you so much for staying with us all the way to the end. Wishing every one of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.